welcome to another episode of Contemplating Resonance. I'm your host, Matt Stine. I'm glad you're here with us today. If you've been listening along this season, we've been diving into stories of religious trauma and exploring how it's shaped the lives of our guests and the ways that they found healing. Today's episode is going to feel a little bit different than the others because rather than talking about our guest's direct relationship with religious trauma, we're actually going to be talking about some of the systems that perpetuate it. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, I'm joined by John Sundman. John is a retired Martha's Vineyard volunteer firefighter and construction laborer, not too proud to crawl in his belly like a reptile to insulate Carly Simon's floor, and the nanoscopically famous author of mind-bending, hacker-tastic, philosopho-sexy biodigital novels of uncanny believability and literary flair. That is a fantastic bio, and I recall the story about Carly Simon's floor from reading your Substack. That's a good story. So can you tell our listeners maybe a little bit more about what you do now, what drives your work, what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a Substacker and a novelist, and I'm retired from a career in high tech and a bunch of micro careers in being a working class hero here on Martha's Vineyard. So I'm 71 years old, which explains part of what we were talking about before we went on the air, how I got so many different experiences. And the answer is you just live long enough and shit happens, you know. But so we'll see it, talk about it when we get into the religious parts of our discussion. But I was raised Catholic, and I went to public school through 8th grade, but then I went to a hardcore Jesuit school in Manhattan for high school. And it was Jesuit and ROTC, if you can imagine those two together.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but I don't feel that I was traumatized by my Catholic upbringing. I stopped identifying as Catholic when I was about 15, and I'm not religious now. But anyway, so after college, I worked in rural Africa for about the next 5 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then as a student of West African farming systems. And I think that experience colored a lot of how I've looked at the world ever since then. I kind of stumbled into a career in high technology, starting in 1980, working for a computer company. And I didn't know anything about computers when I started that job as a technical writer. But I ended up spending 15 years working for computer companies, both in Massachusetts and in Silicon Valley, California. And then I moved to Martha's Vineyard in 1994. And since then, I've spent about half my time working remotely for computer companies and software startups and stuff like that, all over the place, but mostly in the Massachusetts and Silicon Valley. And I've also been a working class hero. I've been a construction laborer, truck driver, forklift operator in a warehouse here. Long time married to the same person who's a molecular biologist, now retired. And we have 3 children, all ostensibly adult, so they say. And I've written 4 novels that mostly have to do with the convergence of biological and digital technology. And they all seem to also have a lot of Christian mythology overlaid on them. And I've got another novel coming out soon, and that's what I do.
Wow. It's still, yeah, again, we were talking about this before about your stories, and just like that little summation there of the high points. And I know that the high points because I've been one of your readers for a while now. Yeah, I don't run into too many people who dip their hands into as many different things. That's what I find remarkable about your background.
Well, thank you. I really can't imagine any other way of living. I meet people. My wife's originally from Evansville, Indiana, which is, I don't know if you know the geography of lower Indiana, but it's much closer to Kentucky than it is to Chicago,
Right.
and culturally. But my late mother-in-law worked in the same factory in Evansville, Indiana for 45 years. It's like, how do you do that? I mean, I know people do that, and I know people live in the same town they grew up in and for a long time, but I kind of stumbled into the computer industry because I needed work. My girlfriend was pregnant, and then I found out that I enjoyed it. It paid well. I enjoyed learning about this stuff. And then after a dozen or so years, I started to get really burned out. And we had children with health issues. And we had vacationed on Martha's Vineyard, which is an island south of Cape Cod. And we like it. We liked it there. I said, fuck it. Let's move to Martha's Vineyard. I'll be a freelance writer. And I had all kinds of contacts in the technical industry. I said, I'll just write books. I'll write the Dummy's Guide to this and the Dummy's Guide to that. And I'll make good money because I had friends who were doing that. And then we moved to Martha's Vineyard. It didn't work out that way. But I didn't get the book contracts I was hoping for. And I needed money. So I got a job being a truck driver. You do what you have to do.
Yeah.
Right? So, and then I happened to live on an interesting island. And I met all kinds of people from all different walks of life, from people who work in the trades, construction people, plumbers, electricians, excavators, and so forth, and the retired intellectual set, writers and professors of philosophy, and there's a very interesting mix of people here. I mean, when you're on an island, everybody has to rely on everybody else.
Right.
I was a firefighter, and there's 6 towns on the island. It's 100 square miles. And the winter population is about 20,000. Summer population is about 150,000. With all the summer people come.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a big fire, nobody's coming from off island with their fire trucks to help out. We've only got each other, know. So that the notion of community, I think I'm very lucky. The notion of small town community is very real here on Martha's Vineyard among the year-round residents, and even among some of the seasonal residents, because they have such a strong connection. Their families have been coming here for 200 years, and so they only come in the summer, but they consider this like their second home.
Yeah, that's, I'd say, the closest experience I have had to that is a place that we vacation often in the panhandle of Florida, between Destin and Panama City Beach. Among other places, there's a little town called Seaside, which was where they filmed The Truman Show. It's there is a community that lives there, but they're surrounded by a significant part of the year by people who have been coming there for generations.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get, if you talk to people, you get some interesting stories. So back to your computer writing career, you were at Sun, right?
I was at Sun Microsystems, yes.
How long was your Sun career?
About 9 years.
9 years?
So, yeah, my first job was at Data General, which no longer exists, but I started in April 1980, and it was a pretty big player in those days. They made mini computers.
Is Data General the one, the soul of a new machine?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So
okay.
The Soul of New Machine, as most of your readers probably don't know, was a book that was a nonfiction book that was written about this pell-mell rush of a underfunded team of computer engineers to build a computer which was needed basically to save the company from its competition.
Mm.
And there was a guy who was the feature that the key figure in that story is a guy named Tom West. And he was this charismatic, self-taught computer engineer who was really like a force of nature. He would work all day running this team of computer engineers, and then he would drive into Cambridge near the Harvard campus, about a 45-minute drive away, and he would play in a folk singing group and at one of the legendary folk clubs of Harvard Square. And then after that, he would go to parties until 6 a.m, and then he'd go back to work without sleeping. It was just this colossal pile of energy, and he was totally informal. Anybody could talk to him. And I ended up working with Tom I worked 4 years at Data General, and I got to work with him pretty closely. So when people say Soul of a New Machine, I say, oh, you read it. That's great. And I wrote one of my blog posts. I wrote one of my books about Tom West, actually. Tom West is a big figure in my second book. Anyway, so I worked at Data General. Then I worked at a startup called MassComp, Massachusetts Computer Corporation. They were like they started with the same idea as Sun Microsystems, workstation computer based on a Motorola computer chip. And then I left them to go work at Sun when Sun was starting up its East Coast division. There were only about 8 or 10 of us on the East Coast, and the rest of the company was out in California, Silicon Valley. Well, the company grew like gangbusters. I started out as a technical writer, and before long, I was a manager of technical writers. And then I was a bi-coastal manager of technical writers. I had 25 people on each coast working for me, or reporting into me, I should say. And so now I'm a big cheese with managing this 50-person group and spending my life living in hotels out in Silicon Valley and flying back and forth on the airplane. I knew the names of all his stewardesses on TWA. I knew them better than I knew the people who lived on my own street. Anyway, and then Sun said, we're shutting down the East Coast. You can either find another job or move to California. So I tried to find another job. I couldn't find it. My wife and I looked at each other and said, what the hell? Let's move to California. So we moved to California. One of our children got very ill and nearly died. And then Sun laid me off. And so we said, okay, we're sick of this. Let's just go to Martha's Vineyard and see what happens. So that was but then I've had lots of gigs since then, working for high-tech companies, working remotely. And I worked up in Boston, Cambridge. I rented a room in a house with a bunch of guys half my age who were like grad students at Harvard or MIT. And I would just work up in the Boston area during the week and then come home on the weekends to Martha's Vineyard to see my wife and so forth. And I also worked in New York City for nearly a year on another startup, and that was 2012 to 2013. So I've done a lot of construction work and manual labor, truck driving, and so forth. But also I stayed in high tech as long as I could possibly stand it, including something will get us to the topic of my essay about Peter Thiel, which was I worked as a technical writer on a cryptocurrency startup. I did that for a year until I just couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I just felt so slimy working in crypto. So and that was, I think that I left that job about 3 years ago. And that was my last significant job in the high-tech world.
Yeah.
And how about yourself? You've got some kind of background in this kind of stuff too,
I was going to say
right?
this. Well, so our listeners are probably wondering, why are we talking about this on this podcast?
Yeah.
I mean, if this is the first time you've ever listened to me talk, you don't know this. If you poke around, you'll get bits and pieces of it on the things that I've written. But so I have been a software engineer or architect or something adjacent to one of those titles for 25 years. I spent my first 11 and a half years of my career at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which was how I ended up at that O'Reilly Bioinformatics conference that we've corresponded about a little bit, because I had to pick I was majoring in computer science, and they had this thing built into the program at the time. I don't know if they still do, but it was 15 hours. They called it your technical electives. And basically it was like, whatever the heck you want to do, you just have to have some coherent series of courses that somehow relates to the discipline, but is not the discipline itself. Okay, cool. So I'm talking to my advisor. What do I do? She's like, have you heard of bioinformatics? Because this was 1990, maybe 99. Like, bioinformatics was just becoming a thing that actually had a name. And no, I've never heard. It's like, oh, it's basically applying computer science to biology. I was like, okay, well, that sounds cool. I'll go take some biology courses and genetics courses and things like that. And then she knew folks at St. Jude who were kind of standing up this brand new department and got me an internship there as between my junior and senior year. And I guess I did a good enough job that at the last day of the internship, the person who ran the department said, well, if you ever need a job, call me. He's retired now, so I can't call him anymore, but I did call him back a year later because my to-be spouse and I could not make up our minds or even get remotely on the same page about graduate school. So I said, well, let's just go work for a while. I've got a promise of a job. She had a teaching certificate. It's like, okay, we'll go do that for a while. And then a little while ended up being over a decade because kids came along and changed the whole equation.
Happens.
Yeah. You have 4 of them in rapid succession. All of a sudden, you start to think differently. Of course, I quickly found out a few years after the 4th one came along that I was never going to afford this family working for a nonprofit company. So I then went and worked for AutoZone for 9 months.
Get in the zone.
9 months. I learned a lot in those 9 months, but it was a very, very tiny step up in terms of like short-term income. The way they got and kept senior people was, well, you get all this equity. Like, well, my kids can't eat stock. They don't think it tastes very good. So I then latched on to another a company that no longer exists, VMware, and I was in their kind of new strategic application division that they had basically bought a bunch of companies and okay, now this is our application. This is how VMware grew as a company. Was they bought everything.
Yeah.
And as an engineer in a company trying to make all those products work together, when none of them were even remotely built by people who'd ever talked to each other, it was quite an adventure. We spun out into a startup called Pivotal that ran about 8 years, went public about, I guess, six and a half years into that. And so I got to do the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, that fun stuff. That was a cool story. And then shortly thereafter, I ended up at JP Morgan for about 5 years. And I got my layoff in May.
So welcome to the club.
Yeah,
I've had several.
It took long. The one thing that I keep saying is that I've been around a long time this is the first time I've been out of work. I started right after the dot-com boom had already mostly destroyed everything. And I walked into a nonprofit that had a, magical funding source and basically insulated me from that problem and from the 2008
mega crash.
So by the time I moved out into normal industry, we were in the boom years of tech that we've had up until about a year and a half ago. Yeah. So and I was a Java guy for a significant part of that. So Sun was a company that I interacted with a decent amount, mostly through software, but sometimes I ran the Java user group during my latter years working locally here. And so, of course, Sun took really good care of us in terms of
User group
sending
people.
us speakers and free stuff and free books. And when we would go out to Java One, they would have nice dinner for us and all that sort of thing. So that was fun. I enjoyed Sun while they were around. So anyway,
Yeah.
we've probably tried my listeners' patience long enough.
Okay.
But
now
there
we'll talk
is
about-
an angle. There
Yeah,
is an angle here, folks.
This background will pay off, listeners.
Yeah,
Thank you for staying with us so far.
Yeah, this is actually all quite relevant to where we're going.
I do want to point out, I put a placeholder. I have a bonus story at the end if we have time about the first director of Java One, the Java One conference.
Okay.
Okay. Not now.
We will placeholder that. So yeah, this is typically the place in the conversation where we would try to shift into a discussion of religious trauma. That's not your story. Instead, you wrote a post recently on your Substack. Sundman Figures It Out. And you entitled it, I Created Peter Thiel, who, if y'all don't know, Peter Thiel is, one of the most well-known venture capitalists, and has been in on most of the stuff that you've heard of.
And he's also a wackadoodle crazy man with very scary bad ideas.
Correct. Among friends in his areas. And so the title is I Created Peter Thiel, who gave us J.D. Vance, who I know my listeners are going to be familiar with. And then you say, sorry about that. And so in this thing, you're trying to make the connection between what you call Silicon Valley techno-fascism and Christian fascism, which is very much a relevant topic on my podcast. And those things are coming together for us through J.D. Vance. So the authoritarian religious belief systems we've been talking about now for a few episodes, we've made our way back. And so, yeah, tell us about this piece, what led you to write it, and kind of connect it for our listeners, if you don't mind.
Okay. So when I left Silicon Valley, when I got laid off the first time in 1993, 94, I was really kind of in a period of personal turmoil, I guess you might say. And I was really disillusioned with the message of technology in Silicon Valley. It can be really addictive working in that, doing that kind of high-tech stuff, especially if you're at the epicenter. You're not just using stuff made by, you're working with the guys who actually are the men and women who are designing the chips that everything's going to run on. You're working with the people who are creating the Java language, not just using it. And so it's a thrill, and I worked around the clock for a long time, and it was fun, and but then after a while I started to get burned out when I realized how much stress it was putting on my own family situation, and how there were among some people, especially the wealthier people, the venture capitalists and so forth, they really seemed almost soulless. They were interested in power and in fame and in control. And a lot of them still are a libertarian. They didn't believe in government as power for doing any good. And they basically didn't believe in community. Everything is about the individual. And so they are great champions of, ideas like taxation is theft. Every penny I make, I made myself. Nobody helped me. It's all mine. And this, as I mentioned to you before, I had some pretty deep experiences when I was a 20-something-year-old guy working in rural Africa during a time of famine.
Yeah.
That stuff stays with you. And I just realized that working with these people is so different from where I thought I was going to be. So anyway, all of that background shows I wrote a novel, and it's called Acts of the Apostles. So that name is chosen because it's a thriller. It's a kind of a cyberpunk Michael Crichton thriller about an evil genius trying to take over the world, and a bunch of misfits like the Scooby-Doo gang that come together and figure out how to, they discover the evil plot, and then they work to combat the plan of this evil villain. Why did I call it Acts of the Apostles? Because there is kind of like this apostolic fervor among people who are hardcore believers in technology. And they believe that, everything is very future focused, forward looking. And so they believe in achieving immortality through transhumanism. They're big into ideas of personal longevity and finding ways that, looking forward to a time when they'll be able to upload their minds into computers, and they believe in eugenics, genetic engineering to engineer more perfect children, and also hoping to genetically modify their own DNA to counteract aging, So all these things, in my mind, I said, well, a lot of what they're looking into, what they believe in here, is basically just what religion offers, but in a different guise. They don't want to die. And a lot of religions, especially Christianity, promise you don't have to die.
Right.
So that's one thing. It's like fear of death. You're not going to die, but it's not belief in Jesus that's going to save you. It's belief in technology. And it provides a community. You find like-minded people who believe as you do, and you hang out with them to the exclusion of hanging out with anybody else. And you believe in your superiority to people who aren't members of your particular cult. All these things, this reminded me of religious groups and cults. So I wrote my novel with that kind of feel to it. And actually, I made one scene in the book. I basically took the scene from the Gospel of Matthew of the devil tempting Jesus, and the devil takes Jesus up to the top of a hill and says, "Just throw yourself down, and the angels will save you." Right, if you're really the Son of God.
Yeah.
And he says, "Look at everything in this valley. You can all be yours if you'll just worship me." And so I took that scene and I put it in my book, except I had the villain issuing the words of the devil, and
Right.
It's overlooking Silicon Valley, not overlooking the desert where Jesus was. So anyway, the character of that novel, who persists in different forms through all my books, he takes the name Monty Meekman, and like Meekman, like the meek shall inherit the earth, And people who like my book just love that hero. He's so smart. He's so slimy. He's so evil. He's like the perfect villain. I just feel lucky that I knew a couple of people to model him on when I was writing that character. So I've been getting emails recently, plus I've gotten 10 in the last year, saying, Peter Thiel is Monty Meekman, isn't he? And so this Silicon Valley venture capitalist, I don't know if he's even born when I wrote my book. Well, he was, but he came long after. He became famous long after I had published my book. He's not only a venture capitalist and strong libertarian, but he made his money with Elon Musk. He worked with him when they started the company that became PayPal, but he's big into transhumanism and living forever. So it's been demonstrated that if you take, for example, the blood of young rats and inject it into older rats, a lot of their manifestations of being old go away just from the infusion of new blood. So Peter Thiel has blood transfusions of young people, just like he gets young people to donate their blood to him, and he has it transfused into his veins because it'll help him make him live longer. So he's a really complicated, conflicted guy. So he has now made common cause with a lot of hardcore Catholic I call them paleo-Catholics. They call themselves trad Catholics, traditional Catholics. They, the kind of people that Dan Brown writes about in his novels, like, the Da Vinci Code and stuff like that. But these people really exist, and they're really powerful. And they include like William Barr, Trump's attorney general, who did everything he could to subvert democracy in this country.
Right.
And the 5 conservative Catholics on the Supreme Court. Some of them are more radically conservative than others, but they've all been influenced by a lot of these ideas of traditional Catholicism, what they call it. And some of these groups, just to give you an idea, are so far out there that their leaders have been excommunicated by Pope Francis. I mean, they believe Catholicism is too radically Catholic for the goddamn Pope, but they believe in saying the Mass in Latin and all kinds of secret societies and spook and so forth. Anyway, to finally tie it back, J.D. Vance converted to Catholicism 3 years ago, and he considered himself a traditional Catholic, one of these trad Catholics, and he makes common cause with these people. And J.D. Vance became elected senator from Ohio, largely due to financial backing of Peter Thiel. His campaign, when he was running for senator with no credential other than he wrote that book, Hillbilly Elegy, he had no background in anything representing people as a democratically elected person. He just said, I'm a famous writer, make me your senator. And then with incredibly big infusions of money from Peter Thiel and others like him, he got elected to the Senate. And so in the Senate, he is advancing, bans on abortion and all kinds of policy positions that are consistent with Christian nationalism, like the Christian nationalism of the Speaker of the House, what's his name, Johnson, and also the political and financial ideas of Peter Thiel and the Silicon Valley people who are libertarian. They're also very, very big into cryptocurrency. The Silicon Valley Peter Thiel people really do hold outright fascist ideas. They believe in eugenics of the Nazi kind of, eugenics. They want to abolish democratic governance. They want to see the end of the Constitution of the United States of America. And they're really not shy about saying all this. And their cat's paw, if you want, their in is J.D. Vance. And he's also the darling of the Christian right, not just the Catholics, but the Christian nationalists, active evangelicals have, I'm sure you've noticed that they've been making more and more common cause with Catholics or traditional Catholics. And it's interesting because Catholicism is so big that there are arch liberal Catholics and kind of non-political Catholics and radically conservative Catholics. They all fall under the umbrella of Catholicism. So I want to be careful not to imply that all Catholics are of the J.D. Vance, William Barr, Samuel Alito variety of Catholics.
Certainly.
But anyway, they're out there. And so the high school I went to on 16th Street in Manhattan, when I went there, ROTC was compulsory. This was during the Vietnam War era, where I had to wear a military uniform on the subways of New York going to school.
Wow.
Yeah. And so a lot of the guys who graduated from my school, some of the guys anyway, went on to distinguished careers in the armed forces of the United States. They graduated from Xavier High School in New York, and then they went to West Point or Annapolis or wherever they went. But when I was there, some of the guys were big into the military stuff, which I was not. I was the only person in my class who graduated without a military certificate, as a matter of fact. And some of them were big into Catholicism, and I was not. I mean, two things I learned in high school was Catholicism was not for me and the military was not for me. But one of our most famous graduates, my high school's most famous graduate, is Antonin Scalia.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
The arch-Catholic, conservative, obnoxious Supreme Court justice, the guy who helped engineer the theft of the 2000 election, gave it to George Bush, by shutting down the election counting in Florida. on the Supreme Court, Bush v. Gore. Yeah, my high school, if you go back there now, there's conference rooms named after Antonin Scalia. So I do have some kind of a feel for the beliefs of that branch of, Catholic. Whoa. Anyway, so that's it. And that's how I wrote that essay, saying some people were writing about J.D. Vance and his connection to the Christian nationalists like the Speaker of the House and the Supreme Court justices. And other people were talking about J.D. Vance as his connection to Peter Thiel and the crypto-fascists of Silicon Valley. But I didn't see anybody who was writing about tying these two things together and how they work together. And also, I had created a character in one of my novels who looked and acted a lot like Peter Thiel. I mean, people say, this guy, he's like cribbing from your novel, John. You should be getting royalties from him. So, anyway.
Wow. So, the thing that, I mean, obviously I understand you have enough money, you can win an election. It seems, I'm having a hard time understanding the connection between Peter Thiel's goals and traditional Catholic, fringe group, their goal. I mean, other than they both want control, but they don't seem to want to control in the same way. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't position myself as an expert on J.D. Vance, but
sure.
From my study of him, just since he became the nominee, he seems to be a person that has no core beliefs, really. I mean,
chaotic neutral.
Yeah, he's just like whatever way the wind's blowing, that's the way he's blowing. I mean, he was a strong anti-Trumper, and now he's Trump says it's on Wednesday. Trump says today's Thursday, and Vance says today's Thursday, and Trump says the next word out of his mouth is today's Monday, and Vance says today's Monday. He just says whatever he has to say. There's no core belief in him about what day of the week it actually is. And I don't know, maybe, I don't know what his conversion experience was, how he found Jesus through converting to Catholicism. I don't know if that's real or if that's just another, mantle he's taken on because it's expedient. But, I've made a study of cults because I have cults in my novels, and people kind of convince themselves of all kinds of shit. Now, I'm sure you've seen this in your work about religious trauma and so forth. You can, if everybody else around you is believing that, aliens are hiding behind, the 12th planet or something, then you find yourself believing that aliens are hiding the 12th planet.
I was a door-to-door evangelist.
Yeah.
I knocked on doors and tried to get people to accept Jesus Christ. Was completely not just doing that work. I believed that I was doing the work that I was supposed to be doing fully in that moment. And now I cannot get my head into that state. It's nonsensical to me.
Right.
So, I having experienced, and again, nobody would point at the church that I went to and call it a cult.
Yeah.
Unless they actually studied cult tactics. If you study cult tactics, you find out that there are a lot of things that people don't think are cults that are absolutely cults.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm well familiar with how you can, in the right environment, you take away all of the other inputs, and then you put precisely into the people what you want them to believe, and they have no other information. You start to build neural pathways around that information, and you start to change the way people think, and they don't realize it's happening.
Yeah.
And then when you look back on it, if you get out, you had this experience of, wow, like my brain was literally a different brain during that time.
Yeah. Well, you said that very well. And I didn't grow up in a quote unquote cult, but I grew up Catholic, right? So I was an altar boy when I was 10 years old. And, that was when Mass was still said in Latin. And I memorized my little cue card. The priest says mumbo jumbo, and I say mumbo jumbo back. And I believed that I was helping bring God into that very church through the transubstantiation that takes place at this celebration of the Eucharist, But that's not considered cult-like stuff. That's accepted religion.
Right.
So most people say, oh, religion and cults are two different things. But I look at it back now, I say, well, wait a second. How did this stuff get started? It started out as a cult, and then it became more established and entrenched, and theology developed up around it.
Right.
Right. And I think, not to go too far off topic here, I study the writings of some medieval theologians and so forth, and I find it very interesting. And those people were honestly trying to figure out what the hell was going on. They didn't have the benefit of science that we have. They didn't have a methodology to figure out what the hell is going on. They didn't have a way to even ask the questions that we modern people should be able to ask. So they were making sincere efforts to understand why we live. How do we get here? What is our fate? Do we die? And after we die, is that it? Or does something else go on? They were all interesting and important questions. How do we get along with our neighbors? What do we do about sex? They had to figure out all this stuff. But I find it harder and harder to have too much sympathy with people who still fall back on those solutions that these people came up with 800 years ago to problems of today. It's like you don't accept their ideas about locomotion. You would never buy an automobile that was powered by, I don't know, whatever the Aristotelian properties of motion were. So anyway, so I make a distinction between people who believe in religion in the year 1200 versus people who get totally convinced that they have all the answers today.
Yeah, well, I don't really like answers from anybody who doesn't think that they have no idea what they're talking about. Like everybody that's like, I have no idea what's going on, but here's what I have to say. That's who I want to listen to. If you think you know the answers, you don't. But I do want to ask you something that because you brought it up again, and it reminded me that you grew up Catholic, but you didn't consider that a traumatizing environment. But then when we were talking about Silicon Valley, and you talked about how addictive that environment was, and you talked about the harm that was doing to you and through you to your family because of all the craziness of it all. But then we got into, this looks an awful lot like a religion.
Yeah.
I got the idea that it's like, okay, you do have a little bit of religious trauma. It's just of the Silicon Valley religion variety and not the Christian variety.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. When I wrote a piece that I'll send to you after this about the process of how I wrote that book. And, I was pretty crazy when I wrote the first draft of that book. I really was. I had all these ideas in my head. I couldn't make myself stop writing. I mean, I used up all our family's money, There was no food in the refrigerator, and I was still writing a novel, and so that's pretty crazy, but it was.
You have to disassociate quite a bit to do that, don't you?
Yeah, and you have to have, it's like a PTSD kind of experience, I guess, in some ways,
Okay.
So yeah, and I think, I don't know how much to bore your listeners with this, but my mother was an immigrant from Scotland, and she came over by herself after World War II, in some part because she grew up Catholic in Scotland, where there's a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry, frankly. During World War II, she was an 18-year-old telephone operator. And after the war ended, Catholics were dismissed. No more Catholics needed here at the phone company. And so, she came to America. And my father grew up, and his father was a refugee from Finland, and his mother, who had no religion. My grandfather converted to Catholicism when he was 65, but he had no religion when I was growing up. And they grew up in the same household with us. Nana, my grandmother, my father's mother, she was an Irish Catholic of the hardcore, you do whatever the priest says kind of Irish Catholicism, not an intellectual Catholicism. And my father grew up, they were both servants. That's how they met. They worked for a wealthy family. And so my father grew up poor during the Depression, children of a Catholic mother and a non-believing father. He was in the Army during World War II, and then he came out and he went to college on the GI Bill. And he ended up going to St. Peter's College in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is a Jesuit college. And he said his eyes were completely open. Just a poor kid from a family of immigrants, grew up poor during the Depression. And the Jesuits opened up this whole new world for him. So that's why he wanted me and my older brother to go to this Jesuit high school in the city. And, but, my father was, he became more and more liberal as time went on. So he stopped going to the regular church. We went to Mass every Sunday, when I was growing up.
Sure.
My father would, we'd get our baths on Saturday night, and my father would shine the shoes for all his kids. There were 7 of us eventually. And then we wouldn't eat we'd go to confession on Saturday evening, and then you don't eat until you've had communion at Mass the next morning. And then you go home and you break the fast with breakfast on Sunday morning. And that was, so that part of Catholicism was real for me. I went to Sunday school up through 4th grade. Then I started going to Thursday afternoon school because I was going to public school at the time. And I was an altar boy and blah, 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 blah. So it was a part of my life. My folks were not, we said grace before every dinner, but it wasn't like an all-pervasive thing.
Right.
My wife grew up, contrastingly, she grew up in southern Indiana, where 3 of her grandfather and 2 of her uncles were hardcore Southern Baptist preachers.
Okay.
And
that's
so
my neck of the woods.
And she was, quote, saved, unquote, when she was 8 years old, and a very traumatizing experience for her. And when I would visit, when I was first getting married and I would visit her family, everything was Jesus this and Jesus that and Jesus, 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 Jesus. I mean, they were their Christian identity was a much, much bigger part of who they were and what they thought of themselves than anything I grew up as a Catholic, grew up with. Anyway, so that's how I got off on all that. But
this happens a lot on this podcast.
We were talking about trauma. So, I was never molested by a priest or anything like that. Nothing. That stuff shocked me when I found out about it. I didn't even know what went on.
Right.
So I can't claim that I was traumatized in that way. And certainly the Jesuits were really, my high school teachers, they were really strict and very demanding. And the discipline was if you stepped out of line, they'd smack you, So it doesn't mean I got smacked a lot. I never got smacked, but I knew if I did step out of line, I would get smacked,
Yeah.
But still that was, I hated the high school, and my father said, I'd get up, all my friends are going to the local high school. I could walk to it literally from my backyard, but instead I'm going down to the bus for a 45-minute drive into Manhattan. Then I'm taking a 30-minute subway ride. I got to change the cars down at West 4th Street. And then I got to go wearing a uniform. Then I got to, go to drill one day a week, marching around in circles. And all my friends are home trying to get laid, There were no schools in no girls in my school, right?
Right.
And so I remember saying to my father was, I was complaining about the school. He was working in New York City, so we commuted to the city together. And he said, someday you'll thank me. And I said, don't count on it. And, 35 years later, I thanked him because, I grew up on a farm in New Jersey and I learned how to milk a cow and shear sheep and feed chickens and all that stuff, from my childhood. And I also went to high school in the middle of New York City, man. I went to rock shows at the Fillmore East. It was like a 15-minute walk from my high school, and
sounds like you did all right.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I know very few people who know what it's like to be a country boy and a city kid, growing up. And so I think that I was blessed by that whole experience, frankly. And the Jesuits were, I learned Latin, I learned math, I learned history. It was a no kidding, go to hell, rigorous high school education. So anyway, it was not fun at the time, but
Right.
but I do feel lucky to have endured it now that I'm 71 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that makes perfect sense. So I wanted to bring it back to your novels. We touched on it a little bit. And I'm aware of this, but you piqued my interest again, just kind of mentioning it offhand that, the Christian mythos shows up in your novels a lot. And we took a slice of that, but I'd love to hear, dive into that a little bit more. Talk about your books.
Okay.
Tell people to buy them, all that good stuff.
Okay. Thank you. So the first novel, Acts of the Apostles, I'll talk about that for a few minutes. One day when I was working at Sun Microsystem, I was toying with the idea, it was like 1988 or something, I was toying with the idea of writing a murder mystery. And I came upon my friend Todd, and he was a chip designer. And he was standing out in the hallway looking at this big etch plot on the wall, a picture of a computer chip, in other words, the plot that you would use to manufacture the thing. And he was just staring at it. And I knew that he was working so hard on this thing, there was some kind of bug in it. He couldn't figure out why the chip wouldn't compile. And he was a very experienced chip designer, and this was the first time he'd ever been so far off schedule. And he was under enormous pressure to figure out what was wrong and get this chip functioning. I came up, I stood next to him, and I looked at that thing, and I said, let me ask you something. I know how to put a Trojan horse into software. Could somebody put a Trojan horse into that chip, into the hardware design, and you not know about it? And he said, John, there's 275,000 transistors on that chip. You could put the fucking Titanic in there without me knowing about it. So that gave me an idea for a murder mystery, okay? A chip designer figures out that his coworker is surreptitiously building this extra layer of logic into the chip, and that's why it's not compiling correctly, because there's all this secret stuff that the main designer doesn't even know is there. So the guy discovers it's there. He calls up his boss in California and says, I figured out what's going on. And the next night, he gets a bullet in the head. So why would anybody go to all the trouble of putting functions into hardware when it's so much easier to put it into software? So I thought about it. It took me about 4 years to figure it out. But by the time I figured it out, I had brain hacking nanobots and all kinds. But my wife was a molecular geneticist, by the way. So I knew a lot about DNA editing. I learned that stuff because I was trying to impress her once I met her. Started sneaking into seminars. I met this hot chick, and it's like, oh, she knows everything about DNA. I guess I better learn something about DNA. But anyway, so that became my first novel, and I built into it everything I knew about the culture of Silicon Valley and what it's like to fly back and forth between Boston and San Francisco 3 times in 1 week, and that kind of stuff. And I found that the underlying theme, the cultural values of Silicon Valley, echoing the values of early Christianity. And I made it quite explicit in the novel, and I thought reviewers would say, what is all this Christian shit doing in here? But you know what? The book has sold lots and lots of copies, and it's free downloads for years it was available for free download. I don't know how many thousands of people have read that book, and nobody has ever mentioned any of the Christian stuff. They don't even notice it. It just goes right over them. And which was kind of surprising for me, but also I was happy about it because I didn't, it's an extra bonus for anybody who cares about that stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't slow down your experience of reading it as a pure thriller. So then the next book I wrote it's called Cheap Complex Devices. And it pretends to be about a storytelling contest between 2 artificial intelligence constructs. And I wrote it in 2002, and it is, it anticipates ChatGPT and all the programs of today and how they make people feel uneasy because they seem so human-like in some of the things they can do. And so I anticipated a lot of those concerns. And as you read the book, if you're paying attention, you realize it's not really clear who the storyteller is. If it's is it the person named Sundman who pretends to be telling the story? Or is it maybe a brain in a vat someplace? Or maybe it's a swarm of bees? That's what there's some indications that the whole book is being woven by these bees who are circulating in the air. But through that, in the first part of the book, I don't know how much to go into it, but one of the book's self-descriptions, the book describes itself at various points, and it compares it to the story of the Gospels and the three, what are they called, syncretic Gospels?
Synoptic.
Luke, the Luke, Matthew, and not John, right? And and there's a hypothesis that they all came from some progenitor book that was called Q or Q prime or something like that. And so that they are all retellings of an earlier version that can be reconstructed by biblical scholars. And so I said, and I said, but maybe this book, Cheap Complex Devices, is kind of like that. Maybe all these different stories are just echoes of an earlier story that tells, basically Sundman's autobiography. And so it's all wacky, and it's I designed it to be as serious as I could possibly make it. There's some of my stories from Africa are built in, about a child dying of starvation and stuff like that. But also I tried to make it as funny as I could. But I'll read the last chapter of the book about the last page of the book about when this entity, whoever it is, snaps out of whatever brain fog it's been in for the whole, right? And it says, so this isn't too long. It's like 3 paragraphs. Okay, sure. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
It says, the profound idea of nature demands that the giver of life should die at the moment of giving. There's the Christ story for you in a nutshell, huh, Betsy? And the Christ has the TM, Christ trademark story for you in a nutshell. Okay. Not a moment's peace can I find. My soul is dead. And so I go to look for my wife and child a decade too late, and more. I saw them in the dust. They were Jesus, and I knew them not. I have no illusions about my chances of finding them, nor about the chance of doing anything useful for them now if I did. If I find them, they will hate me, and they should. That's it. That's the end. The feeble conclusion to our storytelling machine's first run, an almost but not quite allegory with some clever but fundamentally unworkable conceits, a shoddily built and inexpensive complicated mechanism, a tale of a man like any other, a geographical amnesiac prey to lust and guilt, and living on an island off the coast of Maine, who is also a brain in a vat and a bee who mistaking believes that he is a swarm of bees and a Shaker village. Shall we call then this crafted meta-narrative a sophomoric indulgence or a single run of a buggy program? That question is boring. Here is the fact, the one fact that matters. Jesus is among us. He never left, along with several other lords numbering in the hundreds of millions. He is living in the piss and shit in the hellhole of the earth. He is hungry, he is dirty, and omo booby, he is cold. He is getting mighty pissed off, and I am going to join him. So,
wow.
So you could see that brings together, if you have to read the rest of the book to know the allusions I'm making there, but it brings together a lot of the, Jesus-centric concerns of this brain that's trying to figure out what's going on in the world. There was one time I lived across the street from an institution for people with severe mental illness. It was like what they used to call an insane asylum, the year 1983. And there were all these empty buildings, but there were still some clients there, so people who lived there. And it was set on this 1,400 acres in the middle of developing, suburbanizing Massachusetts of just beautiful nature. It's like a nature preserve. Mm-hmm. And so I was walking there one day, and there was this woman, and I heard her approaching. We were walking like a path through a meadow, and she was talking to herself. And, she was obviously one of the residents who lived there. She walked past me, and then she turned around. She said, "Excuse me?" And I turned around, and she said, "How would you like for Jesus Christ to come back next year in 1984, along with several other lords?" And so I thought about that for a minute. I said, "I don't know. I think I'd like that." And she said, "Well, I'm working on it. And then she was going the other way.
Wow. Amazing.
Anyway, so then the next book I wrote was called The Pains.
Yeah.
And this is set in a 1984 that's kind of a mashup of Ronald Reagan's 1984 and George Orwell's 1984. And so you have Big Brother and Newspeak and all that. And you also have Ronald Reagan and Dick Cheney and all the people from the real 1984 in America. And it's a story about a young guy who's studying to be a priest in their version of the Catholic Church. But in this alternate universe, they don't worship a guy named Jesus. They worship a guy named Fred. And
Right.
Fred didn't
I
die
remember
on the
Fred.
cross. Yeah, Fred was hanged in the noose, right? And so this guy, he's really an anachronism. He joins a monastery in an era when nobody believes in religion anymore. They're just like this small little, he's like a trad Catholic, in other words.
Yeah.
But he's got a good heart. He doesn't realize how fucked up the system is that he's joining. And this is really the most prophetic of all my books, which is so surprising to me. It's about this unholy alliance of Peter Thiel-like techno-libertarian transhumanists and a bunch of Christian fascists. And they want to control the world, right? They want to control. But I made fun of, so, the transhumanists talk about, a lot of them have made provisions that their heads get frozen. So in the future, when technology, right? So it's an illustrated book. There's like 12 illustrations. I don't know if you can see that. It's a frozen head laboratory.
Okay.
And,
yeah.
Yeah. And the artist used his wife as the model for anyway. And it turns out that the Messiah, the Fred, his head is frozen in this lab. So what does that mean to have, God incarnate, to have his head frozen in your laboratory? That's one of the jokes or questions that goes on.
Say there, you don't have an empty tomb anymore.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's so you've got this kind of my take. It's kind of like, imagine you're writing a book that's set in 1984. That's a mix of George Orwell's 84, Ronald Reagan's 84, and imagine that like you've just taken a hit of acid before you try to describe the religion of that day. And that's kind of the religion that exists here in the book called The Pains. And it's called The Pains because there's a phenomenon there that it's kind of like the Catholic notion of stigmata, when your body mysteriously develops the wounds that Jesus had.
Okay,
your
right.
palms start bleeding. And I got the idea that the thing that started my whole work on this little novella was I used to participate in an online diary site where people would just it's kind of like a Substack kind of thing, but it goes back 20 years. And people would just write whatever was in their head, often just like stories about what happened that day. And one day I read this entry, and the first line was, "I woke up this morning with a pain in my body. It felt as if it might have been a soul gone bad." And I just love that. I just love that book. So, I mean, that line. And I thought about it. So I wrote it to the guy and said, "Hey, can I steal that line for a book I want to write?" He said, "Yeah, sure. Be my guest." And so the first line in this book is Mr. Norman Lux woke up with a pain in his body that felt as if it might have been a soul gone bad. And then it describes the pain that he felt.
Wow.
But he is a student in this monastery, and the monastery teaches about this phenomenon called the pains. And so he goes to his abbot and says, "I think I might have the pains." And the guy says, "Every first year student thinks he has the pains." Right. And the attitude of this church, it's kind of like, it reminds me of the Roman Catholic Church's attitude towards exorcism. If anybody comes and says, like in The Exorcist, the movie, you go to a priest and said, "I think my daughter's possessed by the devil," they send you to medical doctors. They don't say, "We'll send the priest right over and start an exorcism." They say, sounds like this is a case for medical science, psychiatric care, or maybe some other kind of medicine, but not for a priest to perform an exorcism. And like only if they've run out of any other ideas and there's no scientific explanation for it at all, only then do they say, okay, we have to consider that this might be a case of demonic possession. And that's how, in my little novella here, that's how the church kind of treats this Mr. Lux's experience of the pains. They don't believe it's real. But then it becomes obvious that actually it really is real. The pain in his body is that of a soul going bad. He's having the Jesus experience. In other words, Jesus takes all the sin of the world into his own self, right? So that he can get rid of it. Anyway, so you can see how Catholic ideas made their way into all my books. And I get it's just because I grew up with all that shit. And I think some of it's fascinating. I'm not like C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books,
right?
But as an allegory for the Christian story, he's trying to he believed all that stuff, and he's trying to make the story accessible to people so they can get the true meaning of becoming, the incarnation of God in Jesus. But I don't believe all that stuff. I just think it's interesting and, fun to think about, and especially because so many people have their lives affected in one way or the other, and as you know, often in bad ways, by intense belief in that stuff. I'm a lot more non-judgmental, perhaps. I'm not selling it, certainly, but I'm not condemning it. I'm just using it as something that's interesting to riff on.
Right. Now it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's and then the other book, the fourth book, is called Biodigital, and that is basically a rewrite of Acts of the Apostles. And that came about because a publisher said, I like Acts of the Apostles, I want to buy the rights to it, but you have got to change some things. And they gave me a $1,000 advance. I spent a year rewriting that goddamn book, and then the publisher went out of business and the rights came back to me. So I slapped a new title on it and said, it's very much like Acts. But it's even a more straight ahead thriller. Depending on, I won't bore your listeners now about the differences between the books, but you can go on my website and find out how they differ. Depending on what you want to get out of the reading experience, you might want to read Acts of the Apostles.
Okay.
Or you might want to read Biodigital. And the book I'm working on now is called Mountain of Devils. And so all the existing books have science fiction-y aspects to them. The book I'm working on now does not. It's a straight-ahead psychological thriller. It's set in the 1970s, and it's a precursor to both Acts of the Apostles and Biodigital. And in those books, there's a character named Bartlett, and she's a molecular biologist, and she's the wife of the main protagonist character, the estranged wife. He and his wife are in the process of, growing apart from each other. But she's a dedicated scientist. And the book I'm working on now starts when she's 12 years old and explains why she has experiencing something traumatic in her own life that makes her decide at the age of 12 that she's going to become a scientist. And then what happens when some bad people, including the young Monty Meekman, find out about her research. So, the Monty Meekman evil villain from Acts of the Apostles, when he's a 26-year-old scientist, professor at Stanford. That's the book I'm working on now. Stay tuned. I've been working on it since forever. I promised to deliver it a bunch of times and missed all my dates, but it really, really, really is almost done.
Awesome.
So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, where do we go to find out about all of these things if we're listening?
I would hope that people just go to the Substack and read some of my essays there. My website is still being updated. It's called johnsundman.com. I hope by the time you make this podcast live, it should be up and fully operational. So you can either go to johnsundman.com or just go to the Substack and find an essay or two to read and see if you like the way I write. Like read the Peter Thiel essay, to see what we talked about here today.
Awesome. Perfect. And another thing that I'll point out, you do these intermittent guides that if you don't know where to jump in, you find one of those guideposts and you get snippets of that sounds interesting, and you can link right to it and dive in. So you give us good maps to your content.
Okay. Is there enough time for a 2-minute story about Java 1?
That's right. Let's do it.
Okay. So there was a rock band in Boston that almost made it to the big time. They were certainly the biggest band in Boston for a while. They were called Human Sexual Response.
Were you talking about human sexual response at some point? Yeah.
You should Google up some of their songs. So they were, I guess the band that you might compare them to were the B-52s. They had 3, but they were better singers than the B-52s. They had 4 singers, 3 men and a woman, and then a really hard driving rock band behind them. So drums, bass, and guitar. So just imagine Cream or something with 4 singers with these delicate harmonies on top of them. Mm. And they wrote really smart songs about interesting topics. One of the biggest hits was called "What Does Sex Mean to Me?" And you should go check it out.
Okay.
And so I was interviewing this writer, and she came back for a couple of rounds of interviews. I had decided that I was going to offer her the job. She was looking for a starting job as a technical writer in the computer biz. And so we're there in a wrap-up meeting. It's me, her name is Casey, and the person from Human Sexual Response. From Human Resources. Sorry, I slipped there. And so we say, Casey, do you have any more questions? She says, I don't know. I'm fine. I just hope I get the job. I really like to work here. And I said, well, I have a question for you, Casey. She said, yes. I said, Casey, what does sex mean to you? And the Human Resources person goes, can't believe to get to see all the lawsuits,
Yeah.
And Casey finally goes, huh? Then she goes, the band? You know the band? I say, I love the band. Well, Casey was the female singer in that band, Human Sexual Response. And they had finally decided that they had to go back to their day jobs. They had tried to become a national best-selling act, and they almost made it, but she had a daughter at home. She had to make a living, so she was looking for a job. So I was her boss for 5 years at Sun Microsystems. She was a great writer and an even greater person. And she moved out. Sun moved her out, relocated her to California because she wanted to live out there. And so she was a writer for a few more years. And then she became the first director of the first Java 1 concert convention. So she directed Java 1 for, I think, the first 3 or 4 years of it. You might have run into her. Anyway, her name was Casey.
I wasn't around in the early. My Java 1 experiences were toward the end. I went to the last Sun run Java 1
before they became Oracle.
Yeah, before when McNeely gave the it was like yacht flags or something to Ellison on the stage. It was really awkward.
Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't there for that, man.
Yeah, it was one of the more awkward moments at a tech show. And then, of course, Larry gets up there and says a bunch of stuff that turns out to be completely not true. Like, yeah, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this, and did none of that. Of course, he couldn't really say that what he was really going to do anyway. So yeah, it was an interesting hot mess to be around. But the one I went to, I guess 2 years previous, when Sun was still going strong as far as we knew, and they were going to build their own cloud and everything, and there were 17,000 people or something at the Moscone Center, and it was insane, absolutely insane. I also went to one of the last Borland conferences in the Santa Clara Convention Center, and that was, geek parties were still geek parties. And not necessarily in a good way always. But yeah, it was interesting being a part of that world for a brief time before it transitioned into the next phase of Silicon Valley. Well, anyway, that's awesome. I love that. You have, again, no shortage of stories. Well, I'm going to, as I like to say, and people now like to make fun of me for saying on podcasts, I'm going to land the plane and say thank you so much for that conversation. It was fascinating end to end.
Thank you, and you're welcome.
Yeah, and thanks to the listeners who hung with us the whole time. I'm sure you were happy as well. If you like to hear good stories, you enjoyed this one. And if you enjoyed it, I would love for you to subscribe to Contemplating Resonance on Substack, which is where you get the full experience, because I don't just podcast, I also write. And but if you prefer to do Spotify, Apple, whatever, I'm just happy to have you listening. If you really want to help me out, those 5-star reviews on whatever your podcast platform happens to be, I don't care about you saying good things to me, but the algorithms do. I mean, I love you saying good things to me as well, but it's not about me. It's about getting the podcast in front of more people so that more people can hear these good stories. So, would appreciate that. Also, we're on Instagram, if that's your thing, at contemplating.resonance. And with that, I am going to say good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I know I've got you all over the place. And we'll talk to you next time. So stay resonant, folks.